Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you might be around the world. My name is Eric Neiberg, and I run marketing and operations here at Scrum.org. And I'm joined by Chuck Suscheck, who's one of our professional Scrum trainers, to talk to you a little bit about product backlog management. This is one in our series of webinars titled Ask a PST, and we try to run these at least once a month where you can ask your most pressing questions of our professional Scrum trainers. Today's session will focus, of course, on product backlog management. Next slide, Lindsay. So just some quick guidelines. Your microphones will be muted, but please ask your questions. You'll see two buttons, one that says chat. Just use that one if it's something urgent, like my sound's not working, or you have a technical question, if you will. Use the Q&A button, which you'll see the little icon for it here on the slide, and you'll see it at the bottom of your screen to ask your questions. We'll moderate the questions throughout, and this session will be recorded and posted and made available on our website within the next 24 hours. Next slide. Just briefly, who is Scrum.org? If you're new to these sessions, Scrum.org is founded by Ken Schwaber. Ken is the co-creator of Scrum and continues as the chairman of our organization. He built Scrum.org with a mission, and that mission is to help people and teams solve complex problems. And we do that through thought leadership, things like this webinar, training. Chuck is one of our professional Scrum trainers. Our training is consistent around the world, no matter who's teaching our courses. All of our professional Scrum trainers go through extensive background validation. They go through extensive training and knowledge sharing before they can teach our courses, and they teach it in a consistent manner all over the world. Certifications. We allow you to validate your knowledge, not just learn, but validate that knowledge through certification and ongoing learning. We have learning paths and other things because as professionals, you're always learning and always looking to grow your knowledge, again, through things like this webinar. Next slide. And with that, I will leave it to Chuck, and Dr. Chuck will take you through today's session.
Thanks, Eric. I just wanted to put these two pictures up here to show that I'm still learning. I'm still a kid at heart. I have a lot of fun with this kind of stuff. I'm one of the course stewards for the Product Owner course. So that doesn't mean that I'm necessarily any smarter than anybody that's teaching the Product Owner course. That just means that I take a lot of the other trainers' material and ideas and fold them back into the actual class itself. I do some judgment on that too. I'm one of the few trainers in the US that can teach the entire Scrum.org curriculum. I can do it because it's fun. There's a lot of great stuff out there, and I'm fairly technical. So I went into the developer area as well as many of the leadership and management areas. I'm also an independent consultant and trainer. Be glad to have you in one of my classes. I'll give you a link to some of that as we press on. I'm a part-time university adjunct. I used to be a university professor at Colorado State University also. So it's just fun to teach for me. And I'm looking forward to doing this. The reason I want to talk about product backlog management, when I consult with companies, I consult with a lot of different companies too. I find that the product owner is really an underemphasized role, or the people that do the product owner work oftentimes think of it as a requirements generator. Through the product owner course, we try and say that the product owner is a value maximizer, not the requirements generator. They can have other people help to generate those requirements, but the product owner owns the product backlog as far as the sequence and the delivery of value, while other folks can certainly contribute to that as long as the product owner curates that information. With a poor product owner, you end up with some poor Scrum. Doesn't matter what's going on if you're developing the wrong thing. I see a lot of misunderstandings of what product owners are doing or should do or can do. And product backlog management is like, oh boy, we can't break this thing down small enough, or how do I write a story? When do I know when I have enough information or not enough? It's just, there's a lot of stuff on it. And a lot of times the guidance is in your organization and in your culture. So we have to tease that out of you all to figure out what works best. So is there another slide there? Great. So we're ready to help me with questions on backlog management, product owner usage. And I'm going to be honest, sometimes I'm going to have to say, it depends on your organization. Here's where to lean. Here's some of the things that you're going to find that are problematic if you go a different direction.
Great, thanks, Chuck. So our first question, what if I can't break my product backlog items down to fit into a say 2-week sprint or whatever the length of the sprint is?
I took off my glasses so I can go, oh, I haven't heard that one before. So why do you do Scrum? Why do you do 2-week, 4-week, whatever your increment, whatever your sprint length is? Why do you do that? You do that because you want to inspect where you're headed to make sure you're going in the right direction. You want to be able to validate what you're creating is right. If you have a piece of work that can't fit into your sprint, let's say, as an example, your sprint is 2 weeks. Many companies use 2 weeks. In fact, the last survey I read said something around 54% of the people that use Scrum have 2-week sprints. If it's great for you, bless your heart. But I'm just going to say 2 weeks to make this easier. If you can't break the work down into small enough pieces that you're looking at something every couple weeks, you're going to have a hard time adjusting. You're going to increase the risk of where you're headed. So ask yourself something this when you have a big piece of work. What's the risky thing that I'm trying to prove by doing this piece of work? It's an experiment. How can I do just a little bit? Let me give you an example. Let's say you're moving to, you're loading up a database with a whole bunch of new data. Maybe you're moving to a new version of the database, so on. You got to write data logs to unload and reload. That might take a long time. You can't probably unload, reload, and get it right in 2 weeks. You might have a lot of work to do. But look at the data and ask yourself, is there something risky that I can try unloading and reloading? Is there something that I'm going to learn a lot from if I do this piece of the data, unload it, reload it? Is there a way to maybe do something simple? There's another approach. Maybe I can unload the customer data and reload it and not put indexes on it at first. That might be a way to do it. None of these that I described are necessarily providing specific completion, but they're giving you a point to say, have I been able to break the work down and inspect and adapt? If you think about it, I always ask developers, yeah, you can't break it down into 2 weeks. Okay. How often do you compile a day? Oh, we compile 30, 40 times. You're doing it. You're breaking it down somehow. Is there a way to put some structure around that so that you can break the work down and inspect something and adapt? That seem reasonable, Eric?
Yeah, great. Thank you, Chuck. We've got lots of questions coming in. Ines asks, where does discovery fit into product backlog management? How do I find time? Well, where does it fit?
Wow. So product owner, here's one of the things. By discovery, I assume you're saying discovery of new requirements, how the product works, things like that. It fits throughout. Let's just put it like that. You have to carve out time as a product owner to understand the product and to analyze what's coming up. If you're just popping out requirements without doing some kind of discovery, you're not quite getting the agile aspect of it. So it's not like the traditional approach where we do discovery and we do design, then we do development, of course. Some of that discovery is a little bit more as we move forward. So boy, that's a hard question to say other than you got to kind of spread that across the work as you're moving. I will give you an interesting way of looking at a problem. This is like my favorite statement. I'm going to share a slide here. If you can delay decisions to the last responsible moment. So in other words, if you have a decision to make, push that off a bit. Discovery in detail is a certain amount of a decision. If you can push that off a little bit and think, I'm going to find these things out later, it leaves you more flexibility. Then when you have to make a decision around, we're going to go this direction, you can learn more by doing. If you have complicated work, as I'm showing on this slide, you want to try to make decisions later, not because you're lazy, not because you're pushing things off, because you're not knowing things, but ask yourself when you have to make a decision, do I have to make it now, or can I push it off later, thereby learn more and apply that to my forward direction? Requirements are a good constraint to have. Wireframes could be a good constraint to have. Detailed design with UML diagrams, that could be good. Heaven forbid everybody does that. But ask yourself, how much detail do I need to put in that now? Can I have less detail so that as I move forward and learn more, I can come back to that particular decision and add more detail to it and make a more informed decision? I hope that answered your question. I'm going to stop sharing.
I think that was great, Chuck. And I think the highlight for me there is you're always discovering, and we're always learning. The whole idea behind Scrum and our sprint reviews is to get that feedback, so we're discovering, so we can improve the product backlog, so that we can adjust our product goals and keep going and going. So I think that helps. There's a couple of questions that have come in, and I ask, please add your questions to the Q&A tab, not to the chat tab, just so that we can record the questions and have them to help us improve these sessions, and also so that they're not in multiple places and causing confusion. Beth kind of wants to piggyback on this question a little bit. If what I need from the team is a spike or an investigation, how do I appropriately work that into a sprint if the outcome is not necessarily known? Outcomes are never going to be known, but go ahead, Chuck.
I love that. I love spikes, man. I worked with this company where they picked in, let's say, as an example, 20 product backlog items, and 15 of them were spikes. It's like, aye, when are you making something? When you put together a spike, it's supposed to be some way to discover something so that you can move forward later, or maybe even in that sprint. You have to figure out, how do I use this Versant database? I don't know. Let's figure it out. Let's play with it for a little while. One of the things about a spike is if you don't put constraints around it, it's like surfing the internet. You're looking up something on a particular API, and the next thing you know, you've tromped down through 30 different websites and you're looking at cat videos. We're trying not to do that with a spike. Try and put a scoped time on it. Try and give it a certain number of story points based on that scoped time. And I know time and story points are supposed to be different here. But what I'm trying to say, if you don't scope it, have some sort of a specific outcome that you're looking for, people will research and research and research. You'll never be done with it. My recommendation is to be careful with spikes, that they don't become analysis and design stories that flow into the next sprint. They're discovery aspects of perhaps a technical aspect or some sort of a business aspect with a defined outcome. I'd try not to have more than a couple in a sprint. Ultimately, the best answer is ask the team, how can we stop having this? What's the best way to manage it for you? Hopefully your developers and product owner and Scrum Master can come up with something reasonable that you'll try. Ask that during a retrospective. Try what you've come up with, revisit it in the next retrospective to see how to handle it. Ready for the next one, I think.
Yeah, we do this a lot in Scrum.org. We'll run spikes because the outcome is unknown, but we have a goal. And we put the goal on that so that we can prove it. And as you said, we review it in our sprint review and see if we achieve that goal so that we're getting some value, because the value that we're getting out of that spike might be the learning that's going to drive the next set of product backlog items or what have you as well. Thank you, Chuck. Mike asks this kind of along these same lines, but a bit different. How much detail is enough? Handling uncertainty, of course, is a hallmark of Scrum, but without enough detail, the team ends up churning and not progressing. So what's enough detail? How do we clarify that?
I was waiting for that question. If I had a specific answer and a succinct answer, man, I'd write a book and make $1 million on it. The way I put it is, you're going to have to inspect this and adapt it. Every sprint, you got a retrospective. Ask the team, is this enough detail? Is this too much detail? How do I know? Some companies use a definition of ready. When is it ready to be talked about in sprint planning? You can try something like that, but always inspect it and adapt it most efficaciously at the retrospective to see how much is enough. I would say, so here's my rule of thumb. And a typical team size through all the companies I've worked with, they're pulling in between, say, 12 and 18 PBIs during a 2-week sprint. I'm not saying that's the perfect number, but that gives you an idea of how finely detailed they are and how small they are. One of my friends puts it like this: a couple of PBIs for a couple of people during a sprint. So the detail should be enough to be able to have a conversation about it with the product owner as it's being developed, and if there's not a lot of churn. During the sprint, as a product owner, if you're seeing churn, and you can probably see that by observing the daily Scrum or asking people, that's a good indicator that next time you ought to put more into it. Sorry, I can't be more succinct. It's one of those discovery things.
There's no magic answer there. It's really about conversation, about learning as the team progresses. You'll find as the team matures of working together, you learn what each other needs and how much detail. And oh, by the way, the product owner doesn't have to add all of the detail. They can work with the Scrum team to help add the details that are required. And one of the big things that I've seen, Chuck, is the need to at least have some sort of acceptance criteria as part of those PBIs as well. So at least we know what we're looking for and describe it. And then part of sprint review, or sprint planning rather, is having conversations about those PBIs so that we can better document it and understand what we're seeing or what we're not seeing. So the next question, do you have any examples of value optimization that product owners may use?
I'm not 100% sure what value optimization in this aspect means.
Okay.
Help me with that a little bit more.
Yeah, maybe Hamandri, if you can provide a little bit more detail and we can get back to that question, I think that will work. So next question, when looking at multiple features or epics in progress, is there any way to best organize a backlog that could combine keeping like stories together so that I can get an idea and looking at, work top down? So obviously, and I'm summarizing their question a little bit and then reading into it, right? We prioritize the product backlog, but do you have some ideas on how we can get other views, other looks at it as well?
Wow. Yeah. Okay. I know what you're saying. So a lot of this depends on the tool, of course, but as you're breaking the work down, some tools have parent-child relationships. So you have the grand Oompa feature that points down to other PBIs. I don't want to say stories. It's easy to say stories. Product backlog items. Another way to do it, I've seen people do it in DevOps. They use Azure DevOps. They'll use tags to point to certain areas. You put certain information on the different PBIs depending on the tool itself. One thing that can help you too is do user story maps. They're really great. You can go out on the internet and find some videos on it. Watch a nice short video on user story mapping, just a way to lay things out underneath of each other. Color coding might be good. Even just going to the comments and putting something into the tool. Say, this guy belongs to XYZ. That might help. One thing I do want to point out, if you have 5 features you're trying to develop, as an example, and each one of those 5 features has a handful of PBIs underneath of them, don't develop everything in this feature, then this feature, and then the next sprint this feature, and then the next sprint this feature, and then the next sprint this feature. Try and do something in such a way that every sprint is touching each one of these features a little bit. How much? I don't know. Depends on your organization and what you're making. But if you do it in the first way, we do this one to completion, then this one to completion, then this one to completion, et cetera, and you start to fall behind, this poor little piggy up here might not get any work done, or you have to push work out later because this guy's not even started yet. It might be better if you vertically slice all of these and evolve them. And then let's say you're starting to fall behind on a desired date. I would rather have this one have 80%, this one have 80%, this one have 75%, this one have 70, and this one have 70, rather than 100, 100, 100, 50, 0. We'll try and mesh them together. User story mapping is a great tool to help you with that. Linking them together, also another company I worked with, they used Confluence and they put together just a wiki page. And they'd have a big granddaddy feature with links out to Jira and had each one of those PBIs that related to that feature. And you could replicate them in different parts too. You could also do that, I'm sure, in SharePoint.
Thanks, Jeff. Next question. I'm helping an infrastructure team write user stories for modernizing their platform. It's been a struggle to bring out the value because they see themselves as the users. The descriptions get very technical. Do you have any tips on how to raise it up and become more descriptive and rather than solving the problem in the user stories, describing the problem, if you will?
One of the things you might run into is, what's the value of this thing? It's valuable to me because I'm an architect kind of guy. But what do you do that provides value to people at the closer to the end user, let's say? So looking at the value from a business perspective, your infrastructure guys do good stuff. They enable other people to be able to use the system more effectively, more efficiently. Maybe you're doing something for performance. Maybe you're upgrading to the latest version so you don't have hacks into your system or can use the latest, most efficient pieces of a tool. Those would be some of the business values around that. The technical aspect of it. Go back to the people who are writing these up and ask them, can we look at it in such a way that we break it down based on a business need? And even if it's a more technical business need, that's okay as a start. But if we can break it down and then move on to more technical aspects, more deep technical aspects, so that we can start to evolve that and make sure we're not making a mistake technically. So trying to reorient that more toward a business need rather than the technical need, and breaking off into smaller pieces of evolving that technology can help.
It's just
hard to answer this too succinctly without specific examples, but stepping back and thinking of it from a business perspective will help.
I actually had a webinar, yes, I think it was yesterday, around the role of the product owner. And in one of the conversations we had was getting that mindset of from problem solver to problem describer. And it's really moving. You're not there in those user stories to solve the problem. You're describing the problem, and so that the development team, the developers, can then come up with the best solution. And often people don't know what they want and don't know what they need until they know. And you know, I always I'll show my cell phone. Well, what other things do you want to do on your cell phone? People don't know. But if you say, well, what problems are you having? They start asking those probing why questions, it starts to drive to sometimes better stories and better descriptions.
But before we go on to another question, Eric, I gotta get on a soapbox here. The one thing I see a lot of times is people use Scrum for product delivery and development. Cool, that's good. That's a level 1 version of Scrum. What they don't do is use it as kind of a hypothesis experiment approach. And by that, I mean, at the end of a sprint or a couple sprints, you release to the customer, woohoo, we've developed something. We've developed what we think the customer is going to have that's right. Think of a release, though, push to production as an experiment. I've got a good hypothesis on what I've built. And then I got an experiment I'm running by pushing it out. After you run an experiment, it's sure a good idea to look at the results of the experiment. So you might be delivering what you think is good value, but if you don't follow it up after delivery with some kind of a way to say, is it really the value that we need? You're getting feedback from the customer. Are we really delivering something? Are they using it? If you don't go through that kind of a loop to perfect the product rather than just deliver something on a time frame, you're missing out on some of the nougaty goodness of Scrum. But go ahead, Eric. That was my
no, that's great. So Martin asks, and this kind of probably relates this a little bit because these types of projects are often experiments. Have you seen some examples of applying Scrum in business intelligence projects? How is the product backlog different, or is it any different in such types of projects?
Boy, I have, but I'll be honest here. I'm a business intelligence ignoramus. It sounds kind of funny, doesn't it? I haven't used it for years with folks. And quite honestly, I don't remember many of the details. So I'm sorry. I know they do it, but I haven't been involved with companies that do it recently, at least for probably 7 years.
Yeah, we've done a little bit of it here at Scrum.org. And essentially what we're describing are some of the hypotheses that we're trying to understand so that the developers can then build those analytics on those hypotheses. And then we review the outputs as a way to see, are we getting the data that we want? Or do we need to refine that and go back? So it becomes very fluid from a product backlog perspective. And often we'll review it prior. So yeah, we don't wait till the review to review it. When they have something for us to look at, we look at it together. It's, oh, wait, yeah, I hadn't thought of that, right? Because often with business analytics, until you see the data or the output, you don't think of everything. So we'll sit and look at it together. Oh, wait, can I see it in a different view or a different way? Or, without this other piece of data, which isn't included because we didn't think of it, it's not as valuable. And we start going back and forth. It becomes very iterative and interactive between the stakeholders and the developers who are building it out.
Boy, it makes management nervous when you say, our sprint plan is a hypothesis and our sprint is an experiment. And we review the results of the experiment at the sprint review. And even better yet, our release is an experiment and we review the results later. Product owner should do that. People are like, wait, a hypothesis, that's just an idea. An experiment, that's just something that's like, trying to light a leaf on fire with a magnifying glass. No. Your hypothesis is a darn good hypothesis. We've thought about it. We've planned it out. We're pretty sure this is going to work. Our experiment is not like willy-nilly trying something. It's like, well, we got a good idea. But if you get that mindset that it's not perfect, we're going to learn something later. We're going to learn something at the sprint review from those who are looking at it. We're going to learn something after the release. Is it really being used that way? Man, you get some really good stuff coming back into your product backlog, and you do what Scrum and Agile is really supposed to do. Make the right thing, not necessarily what you think the right thing is.
Yeah, and as you learn, you improve. And a great example of this that happened here at Scrum.org is somebody wanted to know how many people have more than one certification. So that was okay. And this is all business. This is BI. So developers went off and built that view. And then the person who needed that information said, okay, this isn't really valuable because if I don't know which one, but they didn't think of this up front. If I don't know which certifications, it's really hard for me to see, are they correlated or is it just coincidence that they got two? Are they going down the PSM path and looking at becoming better Scrum Masters because I have now PSM 1 and PSM 2? Or are they a consultant who's gathering lots of certifications and they've got a PSM 1 and a PSPO 1? So without that extra data, it wasn't as valuable, but they didn't know that until they started to see the data. So then as they saw it, we created new product backlog items to continue to improve that BI and to allow for better analysis over time.
Absolutely.
That is true empiricism. We saw what we saw it wasn't as valuable as it could be, and added new product backlog items to improve the information that we were getting. So moving on, Joannes asks, in our refinement sessions, we talk a lot about the priorities and requirements and how to do the implementation. But we always have a hard time to get to the discussion around outcomes in the stories, especially to get to the right level of abstraction and don't formulate the stories to technical is always difficult. Do you have any advice on how we can improve? Stop talking about the technical implications, but really talking about the desired outcomes.
This sounds like some psychology tricks that your product owner wouldn't be doing so much as your Scrum Master would. I'd ask the Scrum Master, hey, can we try a few things so we don't get into such technical details? So you can try silly things like every time you go down into a technical realm, we're going to, I don't know, put a mark up on the board. When we get so many marks, we're going to not get donuts this week or something like that. Or other aspects of it, when you come to the retrospective, you ask the team. We're getting into a lot of the details of the technical aspects, pardon me, but not getting into the why behind it. How can we get more into the why? There's a lot of different tools you can use around those two different canvases that might be able to help you, like a business model canvas or a lean UX canvas. You can reformulate the questions so that they're more business oriented rather than technical oriented. You can be a mean product owner and say, what do I care about that? You guys got to figure that out. You're the smarter folks on the technology side. It's kind of hard to answer too succinctly on this, but I'd rely on the Scrum Master and particularly bring it up in the retrospective. Make it strongly visible. It's not transparent. It's going to be tough to fix. Great. Press on there, Eric. That was good enough.
How can a product owner help to manage, or how do we manage carryover from one sprint to another? So I guess I assume Elise is asking, how do we deal with undone work?
I'll answer that real quick. Stop doing undone work. Well, go figure. I know it's hard. First thing, if you have a lot of undone work and it's just carry over. I've seen this all the time, that people carry over and eventually it's the point where it's like, well, today's sprint review, tomorrow's sprint planning. We're just going to do the same thing next sprint. We just haven't finished this stuff. Why do we even have a sprint? We'll just drink coffee and smoke cigars out back instead. So you got to consciously try to avoid that. Break your pieces up into smaller pieces too. Try and look at ways where these small pieces don't have dependencies. If you're in a situation where your stuff is not getting done in a sprint because there's an external group, you have to check it out with legal to make sure that this thing is correct. So it's going to wait until legal gets around to it. Maybe your PBI should just stop at the point that it's turned over to legal and then write another one that says, I receive it from legal and do some other work. I hate to say it, but user acceptance testing might be the same way. If your carryover is people aren't getting to it until late, look at the throughput of your sprint and see what's going on there. You don't want to have a lot of stuff started in the last couple days if you know you're not going to finish it. Trying to reduce that by breaking the work into smaller pieces. So you get to the end of the sprint, here's a piece of work that's not done, put it in your product backlog. And then when you go to planning, replan again. A lot of people say, well, should I get partial credit for my story points? Well, it's kind of a this or that. The advantage of getting partial credit is you're getting some more precision on your velocity. But is velocity really something that's precise? It's like, oh boy. And you spend a lot of time trying to figure out how to split the points. Oftentimes I tell people, if you don't finish it and you're doing story pointing, don't worry about it. Get 0. Next sprint, you get all of it. It'll work out in the average anyhow. Which people say, well, yeah, but we got this 13-point story, just a little bit more work. Should we plan in more work this sprint? Well, yeah, it makes sense. But if you don't, what will your people do? When they get toward the end of the sprint, they got more capacity. Hopefully, they'll go back to the product owner and talk about the product backlog and say, can we get something else? Well, it kind of works out in that case. Do some root cause analysis in the retrospectives and ask the team again. It's the team's decision. How can we fix this? Good enough, Eric?
Yep. Thanks, Chad. So next one, I don't know if you have any experience here, and it actually might sound a little bit more like the role of the Scrum Master, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Suleiman asks, how do you manage the product backlog when you have volunteers? So I assume Suleiman works in an NGO based on what they're saying here, working on the project. So how do you manage those product backlog items? Any thoughts? Any suggestions?
You figure it out, send me an email. I'd like to be able to do that too. But I've worked with a couple different conferences that I've set up, and it was all volunteers setting it up. And we used a Scrum approach, and we didn't have a daily Scrum, so I guess it wasn't really Scrum, but we'd plan out every couple of weeks and go through it. And we'd have our daily Scrum a couple times a week. Shame on me, Eric. Don't report me, please. I think the key for us was that we had people that could commit to really working on it, really giving us that time. Part of it is that we're going to allocate 4 hours over the next 2 weeks to really work on this, making sure that you're doing it. That was my experience on it. And Eric, I think you have more experience on it here with Scrum.org. A lot of people volunteer to do stuff with y'all.
We do. A lot of it's scoping it small. That's probably one of the biggest things is keeping that scope small. And we're better off pulling more things in if people have time rather than trying to fill our sprint backlog. From a prioritization of the backlog in general, we prioritize the backlog the way we prioritize any backlog. Here are the most important things and move it down. But when we get into sprint planning, we set a goal and we prioritize based on that goal, but don't pull much in. Remember, sprint planning does not have to equal a complete sprint backlog. Sprint planning means we set our sprint goal and we have enough work to get started. And even if we did have a complete full sprint backlog, hopefully we learn on day one and on day two, and it changes anyway. So we don't need to fill that sprint backlog. We need enough to get started, and then we focus on, are we getting toward and heading toward our sprint goal?
You know, I want to add one more thing to that. If you have volunteers and you're pulling in work for the next sprint, next couple of weeks, if you have a PBI that you pull in that has to have 3 or 4 people working on it, and they're volunteer and they're partial time volunteers, it's going to be hard for them to coordinate. So you might want to see your organization, maybe it's better to have those things able to be worked independently.
Yeah. So yeah, managing those dependencies are really difficult if people aren't available. Chuck, do you have any good techniques that you use for prioritizing the product backlog? Anything you'd recommend? Any tips or tricks or any exercises that you frequently use?
One thing I've seen people use, simple techniques are like go out to Liberating Structures and read about 2510, the way to vote things up and down. I've seen buy a feature, which is kind of fun when you have multiple stakeholders. You give them a certain amount of funny money, and they allocate their money to just different stuff on the product backlog, and stuff with the most money kind of flows to the top, as an example. Other things you can try, value pointing. You ever do story pointing with planning poker cards? Why can't you do that with value too? So you get several stakeholders in the room, put value and stuff. Ultimately, it's going to be the product owner's decision, but these are different ways to gather information from people. I would also recommend your first few sprints, trying to get your backlog worked out so that it's something really, 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 really simple, shockingly simple. And it allows you to learn so that the next sprint, you've learned something. It's not such a big, risky new thing. And the next sprint, you're learning more. So looking at risk, looking at what you're going to learn, getting input from other people through values, poker, or 2510, or buy a feature. Those are some of the things that I look at. One other thing I want to be pretty clear on this. Product backlog is not sequenced by priority, at least the top of it. It's sequenced by potential order of execution. So by that, I mean, get my product backlog here, the best visual aid in the planet Earth. $2 card deck. Here's my product backlog. These are the things in the order that I expect to execute them. Here's priority number 1, getting money off of your credit card. I want to get paid, but I can't get money off of your credit card until I set up some connections with a bank. I set up some sort of way to be able to collect from your card, and then I can actually get the credit card money off of your card. So what I'm trying to say is, this guy's going to be up near the top, but if I do it just by business priority, by some sort of a calculated return on investment, the further up toward it gets, the more dependencies are going to depend upon when things get implemented. You good with that, sir?
Great, thank you, Chuck. And I added in the chat for everybody. There's a great website called Tasty Cupcakes, yes, which has lots of activities and games and things that you can use, not just in product backlog management, but in other areas too. But there are a lot of product backlog activities and things that can be used. So I threw that out. It's just tastycupcakes.org. But I threw that in the chat for those of you who are interested. So next question. Lauren asks, do you have any good examples of acceptance criteria? What would acceptance criteria look like? What does it mean? Any good examples?
Oh, okay. Yes. So acceptance criteria is typically specific to user stories. We call the stuff in your product backlog items because you can write them in different ways. They don't have to be user stories. But let's assume neither here nor there. We put some acceptance criteria. To me, a user story written up, and it's a card with a promise for a conversation about this. It's not the ultimate layout of everything. It's a way to think to how do we communicate? How do we have more conversations between those that are requesting the work and those that are implementing the work? Acceptance criteria to me should be like, verify that this works, verify that this happens, verify that. If you get too detailed, you end up putting acceptance criteria that's like, put this number in this field, make sure it's masked to a dash here and a dash there, make sure this happens, make sure this happens. It becomes test cases. Then you start writing these big, huge honking stories that could choke a horse, as they say. Acceptance criteria to me starts out as just a line with 3 words, verify that. It's 2 words. So we're putting together a login system. Okay. Verify that the person is registered in the system once they hit the login button. Oh, okay. Verify that people that aren't in the system get rejected. Okay. Verify that they type in the password, we give them the opportunity to reset their password. That's level 1 on acceptance criteria. Other acceptance criteria, some of those are important enough that we want to add more formality to it. That's when you might want to write it out as given, when, then at the acceptance level. So you might have a PDI with several acceptance criteria. A couple of them are kind of loose. Just verify that this happens, make sure that this thing is scoped. And one of these, you want to get more into it. So you put, given this situation, when this happens, then this is the result. Like, given the password doesn't contain a special character, when somebody tries to enter it, then I get a message. You better put in a special character. Some of those given, when, thens are really important, and you're going to do them again and again and again. You can take that given, when, then, or Gherkin format and start to automate those. So I try and tell people when you're just writing the PBIs, just try and write out, verify that, then go back as you're refining them, add a little bit more detail on the improvements. And then when you refine it again, add more detail on it, and perhaps even automate it as you start to code. So you have some sort of a safety net when you ever change that. Is that reasonable?
Thanks, Chuck. Next question here. What are some considerations in migrating from an old system to a new system? You're trying to build out the new one, but you still need to maintain the old one. How would you manage that from a product backlog perspective?
I talk to customers. Say, you know, what's the thing that you do the most? Or get some metrics into your system, some sort of instrumentation. What do people really use? We might want to look and say, okay, we're going to migrate some of the system, but it's the stuff that people are using a lot of. That makes sense. And then later on, we'll put on the next tier. Later on, we'll put in a little bit of the next tier. So we're learning. Another way to do it might be to say, oh, what's the functionality that gets us the most money? Maybe that's the piece to implement first. Another way to do it is to say, oh, the customers that are our big whale customers. We only got a couple really big customers. We got a bunch of little ones. Maybe the functionality that those big whale customers are going to be the first things we put together. When you implement it, another thing you could possibly do is put in feature flags in the system to say, okay, for certain people, we're going to turn on this part of the system, which is the new functionality, and make sure that it's providing the appropriate functionality for these customers. Just doing a product backlog that's a list of everything that the system used to do and moving forward like that, then pulling the trigger at the end can be kind of risky from time perspective, and implementing things that look like they're good, but they're actually workarounds for bugs. Just try and start really small. And even with maybe even a small cadre of trusted customers.
Yeah, one of the things, I've worked on a couple of projects where we tried to redesign the existing product. Generally, they've always failed. And usually it's because you never satisfy all of the requirements of how the existing product was used, and you're just trying to modernize it. So a couple of suggestions would be to look at how it's actually being used, not how it was designed to be used. As product owners and product managers and business analysts, we make a lot of assumptions that people are using the product the way we intended it to be used. And often that is not the case. So really spending a lot of time with your users to understand how they're using the product first, and then defining those use cases of the how before you go into the what. The other part, if at all possible, rather than big bang of, okay, we're going to replace X with Y, is there a way to transition gradually from X product to Y rather than just a rip and replace? I've generally found that rip and replace ends up disappointing more people than satisfying, especially existing users. You may satisfy the new users, but often you end up having to maintain two completely separate products for those reasons. So I think we have probably time for one or two more questions. A couple of good ones in here. This is an interesting. Go ahead.
I got to say one more thing about this.
Please.
This is exciting to me. You know, one company I worked with, they were doing one of these migrations to a new system. It was to support new hardware. And they said, if we don't get it done in 2 years, we're going to be out of business. How do we do this over 2 years? Man, we went back and forth on different ways to lay out the work. And we came to this astonishing conclusion. We're going to do it in 6 months. That really focused them. 6 months. There's more work than we can possibly do in 6 months. No. We're going to do it in 6 months. That way we only get the core. Sure, there were going to be more work coming on, but that might be a way of looking at it too.
Yeah, I think that's great. That one of the projects I'm thinking of was an 18-month project that was always 18 months away. Every month we were still 18 months away because we were trying to rebuild the Eiffel Tower, if you will. So I think we have probably time for at least one or two more. This is an interesting one from Christina I wanted to bring up. So I'll ask the question: what are the drawbacks of splitting your product backlog into multiple backlogs? A ready for refinement backlog, a ready for planning backlog, an ideas backlog, as examples.
What are the advantages or disadvantages?
What are the drawbacks? So disadvantages, I guess.
A lot harder to manage, for one. For two, are you potentially adding handoffs between different groups? You got to be careful of that. Having some sort of a way to see the flow. So if you're looking at it from perhaps a Kanban approach, saying that looks like our workflow, that's kind of good, because you can now start to capture WIP limits between the different columns. You can start to look at cycle time through different areas. So there's a good part on that. The big thing I would worry about is adding a layer of complexity on top of everything that's not very helpful, or that promotes handoffs between different groups. But if you manage it well, a lovely thing. Get some Kanban on top of that. It'll be pretty helpful.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'd add, Chuck, is what I guess I'd ask the question, which I know you can't. We won't get an answer to today, but the question I would ask is why? And why are we creating separate backlogs? Why aren't these one product backlog? It's one product with one product goal, and we're looking at the priorities and the things that need to be done for this backlog. Now, are they potentially separate tags within a product backlog, or things? But otherwise, it makes it very difficult for us to have transparent conversations about the product goal if we have to look across 3 different product backlogs for one specific product. Let's get them all in there and use tagging, or different tools have different things. They have tags, they have color codes. There's lots of different things that we can use in a product backlog, but to have a single place to go to understand what we're doing and how we're driving forward with the product.
And I think I missed the nuance there, that it was separate product backlogs as opposed to one big honking list with different stratifications. Yeah, separate backlogs, it might be harder, even with a tool, man. Whew. The potential of managing that might be tough.
Yeah, and you lose that transparency. So I want to be conscious of time. I know we're just about at our time box here. This was recorded and will be posted shortly. I know we weren't able to get to all of the questions, and I apologize, but more came in than we could get to in the hour. Chuck will do his best to respond to you personally via email to answer those or engage on other questions that we may not have gotten to. And with that, I want to say thank you. Thank you, Chuck, for taking your time. Thank you to the audience for taking time out of your day. I know we're all sometimes tired of looking at all of these, watching Zoom meetings and watching faces. So I know it takes a bit of time out of your day, and hopefully this was valuable to you. And with that, again, thank you very much and have a great rest of your day. Stay safe, everybody.